The air wasn't just cold. It was wrong. It felt like a sheet of ice had been laid across my chest. Yet the New Orleans humidity still clung to my skin, thick and suffocating. You learn to live with the dampness here, the way it coats the ironwork and the tombs. But this was different. I was standing right there by the Laveau crypt. I just finished making my rounds, checking the gates, locking up the tools, and I was ready for the blessed relief of dawn. But then the absolute silence hit. You think a cemetery at night is silent? It's not. There are crickets, the wind rustling the Spanish moss, the distant, muffled heartbeat of the quarter's nightlife. A slow, sorrowful trumpet maybe, or a bass drum thumping a rhythm for the lost. This silence, though, it was total, like the entire city had taken a sudden, sharp breath and was holding it, waiting. I was reaching for the flashlight on my belt when I heard it. A voice, low, ragged, and undeniably familiar. It was my name, Auguste. It wasn't loud enough to be a shout, but it cut through the silence like broken glass. I froze, my old bones locking up. My first thought, the only sensible one, was that one of the street kids had hopped the wall again, trying to leave some offering, maybe, or just cause trouble. But the sound didn't come from behind a marble angel, or from the shadow of a cypress. It came from inside the tomb, right through the aged, plastered over brick that seals the resting place of Marie Laveau herself. Auguste, why are you alone? It wasn't just my name. It was my own voice, the sound of my own voice, but corrupted, slowed down, dripping with a cold that had nothing to do with the air and everything to do with the earth. My voice, calling to me, as if trapped behind the stone. The hair on my neck, what little I have left, stood up straight. Couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My lips were dry, but I could feel a cold, slick sweat break out on my palms. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing the sound to be the humidity playing tricks on the old plaster, or maybe just the distant moan of the river. But when I opened them, the sound came again, closer this time, and laced with a sound that was absolutely sickening. A slow, dragging scratch like old fingernails across bone. Come closer, Auguste. I wasn't alone in that cemetery that night. I know I wasn't, because if I was, who was the second person speaking to me with my own voice from the grave? My name is Auguste. I've lived in the shadow of these monuments my whole life. 78 years I've been breathing this heavy, wet New Orleans air. I'm old enough now that the doctors talk to me about my heart like it's a cracked dinner plate. Handle it gently, Auguste, or it'll break. My hands shake a little now. I won't lie to you. Not from fear, usually just the years collecting in my joints. But back then, I was still the night keeper of St. Louis Cemetery No. 1. For 30 years, from the moment the sun dipped and the last tourist was shooed out, until the dew settled and the first rays caught the moss, that place was mine. I wasn't doing it for the money, not entirely. It was tradition. My grandfather helped build some of these crypts. It was a kind of vigil, a slow, quiet communion with the people who built this strange, beautiful, broken city. I was the bridge between the living and the honored dead. And Marie Laveau's tomb? That's not just a stop on the tour. It's the spiritual heart of the whole place. You see the 3 X marks drawn in chalk. The pleas for luck, for love, for justice. You see the candles still burning when I came around, sometimes red, sometimes green, always surrounded by cheap rum, coins, and the occasional chicken bone. It smelled of old, sweet wax, a little decay, and the rich, dark earth. It was a holy place, despite what the priest said. It was lonely work, yes, but I liked the loneliness. It gave me time to think about my wife. She passed 5 years before this night. Cancer took her fast. I still felt her absence like a phantom limb, always aching, always reaching. I used to walk the paths and talk to her, just quiet words about the day, about the kids. The dead don't judge you. They just listen. I needed that rhythm. The silence was my friend. Kept the noise of my grief locked away. But that night, the silence betrayed me. The night I heard my own voice calling me, I wasn't thinking about my wife. I was thinking about the shortcut I was going to take home, about the soft jazz I could already hear drifting up from Frenchman Street. A slow, mournful blues, perfect for a long, tired walk. The air shifted, and I could taste something coppery and cold. That's when the memory of what I was supposed to be doing snapped me back. I wasn't supposed to be alone. Not really. I had a dog, an old black Labrador named Shadow. He wasn't much for barking, but he was always there, a solid, warm presence at my heel. He knew the cemetery better than I did. I looked down to where he should have been sniffing around the base of the crypt, maybe nudging a stray charm with his wet nose. He was gone. No scuffle, no whine, no jingle of his collar. Just gone. The leash was lying on the wet gravel, limp, as if he'd simply been lifted away, or perhaps just dissolved. My heart wasn't just a cracked plate anymore. It was a drum beating hard against my ribs. I am an old man. I know the dangers of the streets, but I also know the certainty of the dead. And this was an invitation. I looked back at the tomb of the Voodoo Queen. The X marks, usually faded by the morning rain, looked fresh, almost glowing in the dark. The faint, sweet smell of the offerings was suddenly overpowered by something else. Something sharp and electric, like ozone after a lightning strike. My mind, for the first time in years, was screaming not about my wife, not about my age, but about something immediate, something primal. I was a trespasser in my own church of the departed, and whatever was behind that stone wall knew my name, knew I was alone, and it wanted me closer. I should have run. Instinct, that wild animal that keeps us alive, screamed at me to turn, to bolt, no matter my age, no matter my heart. But I am Auguste. I am the night keeper. I don't run from a tomb. But when the voice whispered my name for the third time, my own voice, deep and drawn out, coming from the sealed mouth of the Voodoo Queen, something in me snapped. It wasn't just fear, it was compulsion. I forced myself to take a step forward, but my feet felt stuck in the wet ground, as if the damp earth of St. Louis wanted me right there. It was in that moment I noticed the second sign, the jazz, that soft, sorrowful trumpet I'd heard moments before. The blues drifting up from the French Quarter simply stopped. It didn't fade. It didn't get muffled by distance. It was cut off. Imagine an old gramophone where the arm is suddenly lifted. An instant, total silence. There was no more city breath, no lonely cricket, no rustle of palm fronds. It was just me, 5 feet from the crypt, and this heavy silence. A silence that wasn't an absence of sound, but the presence of something that had swallowed all sound. I raised my shaky, old, wrinkled hand and stretched it toward Marie Laveau's stone resting place. And then I felt it. It wasn't the familiar smell of sweet candle wax and cheap incense the tourists left. It was perfume, strong, intense, jasmine and vanilla, but with a strange metallic undertone, like dried blood or old iron. It was the smell of expensive ancient perfume used to mask what? Death? Or perhaps just the suffocating heat of a body long alive. And with the smell came the most extreme temperature shift I have ever felt. I was sweating, remember? New Orleans in November is still an oven. But suddenly, the air between me and Laveau's tomb dropped 10, perhaps 15 degrees in an instant. It was a pocket of cold air. I could see my breath condense in the cone of my flashlight beam. A weak white cloud, hanging in the hot night air. I forced my eyes to focus on the weathered face of the tomb. It's made of plaster and brick, and it's where people come to make their wishes. That's where I saw the marks, the 3 X's. They were there, of course, but now there were dozens. Hasty, frantic scratches, covering the entire front surface, some overlapping others, all drawn with the same white, flowery substance. Chalk? Cornmeal? And within this confusion of crosses, there was one small, clear circle scratched. Inside that circle, something else, something that looked like a symbol. I had never seen a vev so simple and yet so terrifying. It was just a spiral, but it seemed to pull the light into it. Then the sound returned. This is not possible, my tired brain argued. It's not physical. Can't be natural. I felt pressure in my ears, like diving deep underwater. It was the pressure of a void. It wasn't my voice again. It was a physical sound, real but completely displaced. Crick, CRK. The sound of a heavy, leather-soled shoe crushing the shell and coral grit that makes up the path between the tombs. And it came from behind me. That sound was what broke the cardinal rule. I should be alone. The gates were locked. I spun around, the slow, painful reflex of a 78-year-old man. The flashlight wobbled in my hand, and the beam danced over the rows of vaults, over the marble effigies corroded by time. There was nothing. The darkness, dense and humid, filled the spaces between the mausoleums. It was a darkness that seemed to breathe. But just as I looked back at Laveau's tomb, the sound came again, right near me this time, echoing off the stone. Crack, the sound of a firm step, as if someone had just stopped exactly where my dog, Shadow, should have been, right next to the crypt. And then the whisper, now in a language that wasn't my own, but which felt like it was being spoken directly to the oldest, most terrified part of my brain. Mon chéri, Viens, Creole, French Creole, my mother tongue. The sound of my own voice had been the lure. The sound of the step on the gravel was the confirmation. It was the physical proof that there was something there, in my empty cemetery, that did not belong to the world of the living. And it was calling me in a language that only those born here understand. At this point, the fear was so great it sucked the breath out of me. I wasn't just observing the terror. I was submerged in it. My legs were numb, and I felt a sudden, crushing heaviness in my head, as if the hat I wasn't wearing had turned to lead. I knew in that instant that it wasn't the wind, it wasn't old age. It was a presence, and that presence had just taken a step towards me. I had to see what it was, and so I lifted the flashlight, aiming the beam at the gravel path next to the tomb, where the step had just landed. My flashlight beam, weak and shaky, searched the ground right beside Marie Laveau's tomb. I was aiming for where the sound of the footstep had landed, that distinct crack of a heavy sole on brittle gravel. What I saw was nothing, absolutely nothing. No indentation in the crushed shell and stone pathway. No shadow that suggested a person had stood there a second before. The gravel was undisturbed, the way I had meticulously raked it hours earlier. Yet the chill remained, and the perfume, jasmine and that awful metallic tang, was so strong now it felt like I could taste it on my tongue. Don't look down, Auguste. Look at me. The voice, my voice, whispered again, and this time it was layered with the Creole call, Mon chéri, Viens, my darling, come. It was an impossible fusion of sounds. The old, tired voice of a dying man mind, mixed with the soft, seductive, maternal voice of someone very ancient and powerful. I raised the beam back to the tomb, and I saw the flicker. There was a cluster of candles placed right at the base of the crypt, mostly stubby red and black ones, still burning low. The flames were normally steady, protected from the occasional damp breeze by the high marble walls of the surrounding crypts. But now they were dancing, not violently, not whipping from a sudden gust of wind, because there was no wind. The air was dead still. These flames were simply collapsing on themselves, shrinking to tiny blue pinpricks, then surging back up, tall and yellow, only to shrink again. It was a rhythmic pulse, like a slow, failing heartbeat. And as they flickered, I saw the shadows cast by the neighboring monuments. The stone angels, the carved urns, weren't behaving the way shadows should. They were stretching and contracting not based on the candle light, but seemingly on their own accord. One long, thin shadow, cast by a slender marble cross 20 feet away, detached itself from the wall and slid slowly across the ground towards Laveau's tomb. It wasn't the shadow of the cross anymore. It was the shape of a person, impossibly elongated, gliding without feet. It stopped right at the base of the tomb, merging with the shadows already there, making the darkness around the granite deeper, more absolute. This is where the psychological doubt kicked in hard. Maybe my mind was failing me. Maybe the loneliness of 30 years had finally frayed the edges of my sanity. I blamed my old age at first. Maybe the dizziness I felt was just low blood sugar. Maybe the shadows were my eyes, playing tricks on me in the overwhelming darkness. After all, the doctors had warned me about stress. about my failing heart. But then I reached out my hand and touched the plaster of the tomb. It wasn't cold. It was hot, not warm from the sun, but radiating a low, internal heat, like an oven that had been turned off but was still holding the temperature. My fingertips felt the gritty texture of the plaster, and under the newly drawn chalk marks, I felt a vibration. A soft, constant hum. Felt like holding a tuning fork. The vibration went right up my arm, settling as a deep, resonating ache in my skull. The voice inside the tomb started speaking again, but now it wasn't calling my name. It was whispering, fast, multiple voices at once, all speaking in Creole, but too low for me to distinguish the words. It sounded like a frantic, crowded prayer being recited simultaneously by dozens of people, all trapped behind a thick wall. And the smells intensified, becoming a horrific cocktail of spiritual New Orleans. Incense and smoke. Heavy, choking plumes of frankincense, though I saw no smoke. Decay. A fleeting, sharp scent of rot, like something freshly unearthed. Perfume. The sweet, cloying jasmine, now dominant, almost suffocating. I realized what I was smelling. The entire spiritual history of the cemetery, condensed into one moment. The offerings, the rituals, the bodies turning to dust inside the oven-like tombs. And the eternal, intoxicating presence of the Voodoo Queen, Marie Laveau. I was paralyzed, leaning against the tomb that was humming with life and heat. My breathing was shallow and fast. I knew I should break away, but the hum held me captive. I was witnessing the evidence, but it wasn't evidence for a court. It was evidence for a soul. Or maybe it was really her. Maybe the spirit of the woman who held this city's soul in her hands for a century was finally stirring, and she chose this old, tired night keeper to speak to. I pressed my ear against the warm plaster, trying to decipher the chorus of whispers. I had to know what they were saying. I had to know what my own voice was telling me from the inside. One word cut through the frantic chatter, clear and loud. It wasn't spoken in my voice or the sweet Creole. It was a raw, booming whisper, spoken in plain English, and it was directed right at the core of my being. It was the guilt I carried about my wife, the guilt that I was still here, walking the world, and she was not. I knew then, this wasn't just a trapped spirit. This was an entity that saw my history, my losses, and my regrets, and it was using my own terror to draw me closer. I ripped my ear away from the hot stone, stumbling backward. The hum immediately ceased. The air felt normal again, just thick and humid. The profound, oppressive silence lifted, replaced by the faint, distant rhythm of the quarter's late-night jazz band struggling back into existence. The moment was gone, but the echo of that single, terrible word, guilt, was ringing in my ears. I sat on a broken, moss-covered step nearby, catching my breath, trying to make sense of the night. Here are the theories that kept me awake until the sun finally managed to burn away the fog. Theory 1, the spiritual manifestation of Laveau. The simplest and most chilling theory. Marie Laveau was not just a woman. She was a Loa, a force of nature in this city. They say she could speak to anyone, see into anyone's heart, even after her death. What no one in New Orleans dares to admit is that her spirit still walks there after midnight. She wasn't calling me out of malice. She was calling me because I was the only witness. She used my voice because it was the sound I trusted most. She used the word guilt because she saw the deepest anchor holding my soul to this earth. My unresolved grief over my wife. My fear that I didn't save her. The entity needed me to face my own darkness before it could speak. The moving shadow was her messenger, and the sudden cold was her veil. Theory 2. An echo of a voodoo ritual. St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 is a spiritual meeting ground. Every night, rituals are performed, pleas are made, power is borrowed. Perhaps what I witnessed was not the queen herself, but the violent echo of a massive ritual, a ceremony of binding or summoning that had taken place right before I arrived. The intense heat, the rapid, multi-voiced whispers in Creole, the sudden vanishing of my dog, a sacrifice, maybe, or just scared off by the power. These suggest a temporary opening, a rupture in the veil between worlds, triggered by a living hand. The residual power, fueled by the hundreds of offerings and candles, found the nearest, most susceptible soul mine. The voice wasn't mine. It was the collective energy of the ritual, manifesting the deepest fear it could find, guilt. Theory 3. A trapped spirit seeking release. The warning. The theory that chills my blood the most connects the physical feeling of being weighed down with the fact that I was the night keeper. What if the spirit calling wasn't Marie Laveau, but a restless, trapped soul? Perhaps one of her failed clients or a rival, entombed nearby, desperate to escape the oven-like vaults. The spirit, unable to fully cross over, was trying to possess or lure a living being to act as a key. It used the one thing guaranteed to draw me in, my own voice, whispering from within the stone itself. The guilt was a warning. If you come any closer, if you unlock this, you will carry this burden, this eternal regret. For me, the scratch I heard wasn't fingernails. It was a desperate, physical attempt to escape. That spirit knew I was a key. Theory 4. A psychological breakdown. I am old. I am tired. I am lonely. The doctors said my heart was failing. The pressure in my head, the dizziness, the seeing of shadows that move unnaturally. These are symptoms. Could the intensity of the cemetery, the heavy atmosphere of death I live in, and my deep grief over my wife have finally caused a short circuit? A profound break with reality, where my mind projected its own self-blame, guilt, onto the most powerful spiritual symbol in the city? I spent an hour debating this theory, staring at the fresh X marks on the tomb. Then, as the first gray light of dawn broke over the city, I walked back the way I came. The moment I unlocked the main gate to leave, I looked down. There, sitting patiently, tail thumping gently against the iron bars, was Shadow, my dog. He looked at me, gave a low, questioning whine, and licked my hand. He was completely dry, perfectly calm. He hadn't been missing. He had been removed. And that's when I knew. It wasn't my mind failing. Something real happened in that silence. I finished my shift that morning. I went home and drank 3 cups of coffee. I quit the job a week later. I couldn't face the stone again. I never told anyone this story, not really. How do you explain to the police or the doctor that your own voice called you from inside the tomb of the Voodoo Queen, and it whispered only one word? Guilt? The question I asked myself when the sound first hit me was, if I wasn't alone in that cemetery, who was the second person speaking to me with my own voice from the grave? I still don't have the full answer. Was it Marie Laveau, trying to collect on a promise, needing a new keeper? Was it a trapped, envious spirit trying to drag me into the dark with it? Or was it the sound of my own soul, burdened by my regret, trying to speak through the only medium powerful enough to reach me? I don't know, but I'll tell you this. The silence in St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 is heavier than anywhere else on Earth, and I felt the presence of 2 souls that night, mine and the one that stole my voice. The mystery remains sealed behind that crumbling plaster. I walk the streets now, still hearing that metallic, jasmine-scented whisper on humid nights. What do you think really happened to me that night? Share your thoughts below. Was it Laveau, a trapped spirit, or just the weight of my own regret? And if you want more first-hand supernatural confessions from New Orleans, subscribe and turn on notifications. There are stories here that only the living dare to tell.